Then let's basically begin. Hello and a very warm welcome to this ESIBE webinar in which we want to talk about the European Commission's proposal for a Digital Markets Act. I'm very happy that so many people registered and are actually attending from the EU and the US. I understand that despite the controversies of the DMA, there are at the moment more important issues to pay attention to for policymakers, including you and me, who are merely dealing with economic policymaking. The Russian war in Ukraine hovers over all of us, and our thoughts are with all the people who suffer most from the military aggression by Russia's current government under the heavy-handed regime and rule of Vladimir Putin. And I very much hope that rulers in Russia will come to senses soon. Now, today, we want to talk about digital policy making, digital markets, technology companies, and regulation of online platforms in the EU. The EU proposed the Digital Markets Act, which was very long considered an opportunity to remedy anti-competitive conduct in digital markets. At the same time, we now know that the initiative has become one of the most controversial economic policy initiatives of the von der Leyen Commission. The Commission proposal from December 2020 has now entered the trialogue process. Before, it received more than 1,000 suggestions for amendments by parliamentarians, which were submitted to the IMCO committee. Many politicians called for profound changes. And nevertheless, in the current form, there remain several ambiguities in the objectives, concepts, and the structure of the proposal, which risk to lead to an ineffective regulation with regard to economic outcomes, but also with regard to the prospects for legal disputes. Today, we have scholars from the EU and the US to discuss how the DMA, if implemented, could impact on the European single market. More specifically, we want to talk about differences in impact on certain member states' economies, impacts on foreign companies that operate in the EU. And we also want to talk about the impacts on innovation and, of course, impacts on us, those who use digital services on a day-to-day basis. I am very happy that we have with us today 3 guest speakers. And this is Megan Hogan. Megan is a research analyst at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, DC. And together with her distinguished colleague, Gary Hufbauer, she has just published a very good paper on the EU's latest offensive, how they call it, against US technology companies. And then we have Roberta Spakula, who is the head of research at the distinguished Lithuanian Free Market Institute, a very important voice when it comes to defending the principles of market economies. And his institute just published a report focusing on competition, but also property, innovation, and the interests of users in the light of what has been proposed so far for the Digital Markets Act. And finally, we have Aurélien Produis. Aurélien is the director of the Schumpeter Project on Competition Policy at the Washington-based Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And Aurélien has worked for years now on the intersection of competition policy, the regulation of network industries, and innovation. And I will now ask the guests to have a 5-minute intervention before we turn to questions that I raised, questions that our audience can raise. That said, those of you who watch the event and want to raise question, please feel free to use the chat function and put your question in the chat. So let's turn to our guest speakers, starting with introductory remarks by Robertas, followed by Megan, and then Leyen. So Robertas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you for having me. And I will start with, I guess, the rationale, the basic idea behind the DMA. And it's pretty simple. So by the nature of their activity, the big digital platforms, or how we call big tech, or they're called gatekeepers in the DMA, by the nature of their activity, their success strongly depends on their size and scope. And because of that, in the digital market, the digital market can become dominated by just a few large players, and as it seems to be right now, and that's a concern in Europe. And the real concern is that since those players are large, we have a strong influence in the market. They can privilege their own services, or they can even probably lock in businesses and consumers which don't have any viable alternative except to use that large platform. And so the assumption is, since they have so much influence and impact, they can start acting harmfully towards consumers and their users, and the competitive situation becomes unfair. And so the DMA proposes to curtail or limit the activities of big digital platforms, prohibiting some of them, like preferencing their own products, and mandating others, like disclosing or providing some of their competitive advantages, like search data for competitors. And the problem with that, I think, in the DMA is that it ignores how competition works and the motivation for competition. So the idea is that a big player in the market is somehow becomes unfair, but nobody competes just for the sake of competition, right? The competition is not a goal in itself. In an unregulated market, companies invest, they innovate, they improve to win the competition and to get into the entrenched and durable position, as it is called in the DMA, by attracting consumers with a superior product. So there are questions whether looking at big platforms because they're successful and assuming that there is something necessarily bad about that. There are questions about that. Now, another issue, and I'll be quick here, is that we tend to think of, and I think the DMA tends to think of platforms as public utilities or public places, and everybody is somehow entitled to use them, and so everybody should have equal access to their services. And if somebody is precluded from entering, like for example, an app store, or somebody is not privileged in the search data equally to others, that looks unfair. But unfortunately, I think the treatment is not justified in the sense that public utilities, platforms don't really have any characteristics which we tend to think about the natural monopolies or public utilities. Like we still, if we unplug them all, the internet works just fine, and every platform has its own competitor. There is no such, I don't think there are enough marketplaces more marketplaces than you could ever visit. It's social media. Every year we have new social media companies and growing and competing with each other, and more products. So there are many choices even today, and assuming that the platforms take some choice away from us is also a very, I think, might be unworthy idea. So I'll stop at this point now and see what questions raise later.
Thank you, Robertas. Megan, let's turn to you. Together with Gary, you just published this insightful report about the EU's latest offensive against large, we should say, online companies. Could you give us a few insights. What are the key findings of your study? And one question that I already put in the invitation for this event: is this proposed act really discriminating against US companies?
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. I know I was already introduced, but my name is Megan Hogan, and I'm a research analyst at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, where I assist my senior fellow, Gary Hoffbauer, on trade issues. So thank you so much for having me. This is actually my first panel as a young professional, so it's truly an honor to be here today. Last month, Gary and I published a policy brief analyzing the European Commission's proposed Digital Markets Act, entitled, as you said, "The European Union Renews Its Offensive Against US Technology Firms." In our brief, we listed our best guess at which American and European companies could be captured under the European Commission's definition of a gatekeeper digital platform, based on average market capitalization and the number of monthly active end users and business users. So in its current form, the DMA establishes a two-part test for designating a digital platform as a gatekeeper. First, the firm must perform something called a core platform service in the EU, defined as online intermediation, social networking, cloud service, and other such digital services. Second, the firm must satisfy three different thresholds. So first, the firm must have a significant impact on the EU internal market, meaning it must have an average market capitalization amounting to at least 65 billion euros in the last financial year. Two, the firm must serve as an important gateway between business users and end users, meaning having more than 45 million monthly active end users in the EU. And more than 10,000 yearly active business users established in the EU in the last financial year. And then third, the firm must enjoy an entrenched and durable position, meaning it must have met the significant impact and the important gateway thresholds I just described for the past 3 financial years. So in our policy brief, of the 24 firms that we selected for our analysis, we found that 11 would be labeled gatekeepers, 10 American and 1 European, and then 13 firms would not, so 8 American and 5 European. 5 firms, Ahold Delhaize of the Netherlands, Vivendi of France, and Expedia, Slack, and Yahoo of the United States, they would not meet any of the 3 criteria of Part 2 of the DMA's gatekeeper test. And 6 firms, Criteo of France, Zalando of Germany, Spotify of Sweden, and eBay, Twitter, and Zoom of the United States would not meet the significant impact market capitalization requirement of 65 billion euros or more. We concluded that the DMA discriminates against American technology firms because only one of the 12 potential gatekeepers, SAP, is a European firm. And even so, its designation of a gatekeeper is actually contested. So there is debate whether cloud service providers such as Oracle, which is an American firm, and SAP are designated as gatekeepers under the DMA. And as a matter of fact, last month, 4 major associations for cloud infrastructure service providers, they urged EU lawmakers to designate legacy software platforms that provide their own cloud infrastructure, such as SAP, as gatekeepers. While the definition of gatekeeper may not equate to de jure discrimination against US tech firms, surrounding events almost prove discrimination de facto. The Commission's staff recommendation for a high gatekeeper threshold, for example, would single out only 7 firms, 5 American and 2 Chinese, from roughly 10,000 online firms operating in Europe. And we found that European companies that are direct competitors of the likely targets, namely Deutsche Telekom, cloud service, Ahold Delhaize, online intermediation, and Criteo, advertising technology, will very likely not meet the gatekeeper thresholds. A common defense of discrimination against American technology firms is that they're the big boys and accordingly the natural targets. But that's not necessarily justification for the United States to accept de facto discrimination and abandon its claim to national treatment and intellectual property rights for US firms operating abroad. And moreover, the European Commission's proposed DMA, it does not exclusively target the tech giants, right? Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft. It would also target, we found, at least 5 smaller, albeit huge, American technology firms: Airbnb, Booking Holdings, Oracle, PayPal, and Salesforce. As our analysis is not exhaustive, the actual number of American firms affected by the European Commission's proposed DMA, it might actually be higher. And in its current form, the DMA violates core international obligations, including the national treatment commitments under the WTO's General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS, and Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS, as well as the protection of trade secrets afforded to US firms by the TRIPS agreement. Forceful US protests might still yield significant changes, but though the United States is eager to enlist European cooperation in the nascent Cold War with China and to present a unified front against Russian aggression, as we began this meeting with, right? We fear, Gary and I fear, that weakened US defense, not only of tech firms, but also of other commercial interests, could be costly and an unnecessary casualty of larger geopolitical goals. We agree that tech needs to be regulated, but reasonable provisions in the DMA should have equal application to US firms. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, that was very clear and insightful. We will come back to this in a minute, I'm sure. Aurélien, it's now turn to you. You typically cover competition and linkages to innovation, and particularly in the technology sector and network industries. What is your, let's say, early bold assessment on the DMA proposal so far?
Right. Thank you very much, Matthias, for having me. And I join you in your first comment on the fact that our thoughts go with the Ukrainian people in this very difficult time. I think it's something that we never expected, a war in Europe in the 21st century, and yet it's happening. But it means that first, Europeans need to be united, but also the transatlantic community needs to be united, in a sense that the alliance or the strong historical bonds from North America and Europe needs to be strengthened. And this goes in all directions, also in terms of alliance, but also in terms of regulatory convergence or discussions and dialogues. And just to come back to our discussion about the DMA, what we see is that the DMA is going to be a major source of regulatory divergence. In one word, that's pretty easy to see. We have a number of bills that are proposed in the US that mimic the DMA and take direct inspirations from the DMA and say that we should regulate those gatekeepers very harshly. The likelihood of those bills to pass is close to zero because of the Washington gridlock system and because of also a very wide bipartisan skepticism and rejections of these kind of obligations and bills. So it's very likely that the US won't regulate digital platforms in a way the DMA will regulate. In opposition, what's the likelihood of the DMA to pass? Well, 99%, right? Close to 100%. It's going to pass. And so you're going to have, just a bit like the GDPR, you're going to have a very strong regulatory framework in Europe and no such a regulatory framework in the US. And unsurprisingly, as Megan just mentioned, this regulatory framework in Europe is implicitly targeted to American firms. And this is going to create regulatory, not only divergence, but also tensions. I mean, I remember when Margaret Vestager announced the DMA in December 2020, she expressly mentioned that they reflected within the Commission whether they should make a regulation, like a broad regulation without naming those companies, or have individual decisions on each a company, a bit like the digital market unit in the UK. So it means that the purpose of the DMA is just to target these well-identified company with the pretense of generality, neutrality, and all that. And I think, as Megan has mentioned, I think this doesn't fit first with the international trade rules because it has a protectionist intent that is pretty clear, and it is, of course, unfortunate. But also, it's going to be a self-inflicted harm to Europe, let alone to the US, because if we think about these digital platforms regulating those digital platforms very harshly, there will be always a group of stakeholders that will be voiceless and that will be the most impacted, is that the consumers. The consumers will be impacted and they will not have the sufficient and necessary leeway to voice their concerns or to see that there's something going wrong between the different internet. Some talk about the split internet, right? Having different versions of the internet. I think the DMA may lead to that, that these American companies providing a wide range of innovative services, combining services for the US and for the rest of the world, and a degraded range of services when it comes to European consumers. And of course, European companies may be hurt. So I think the unintended consequences and the cost of the DMA are considerable, but also the regulatory divergence is concerning. I just want to mention that the rationale of the DMA was to precisely have these, clear rules of the roads and to have these ex ante type of regulations. And I think there's nothing further from the truth when these people claim that we lay down very clear rules. I think the DMA, it's not clear rules of the road. It's going to generate years of litigations. Just take, for example, the Article 3, the designation of the gatekeeper. What is the designation of gatekeeper? It's an individual decision by the European Commission toward one company. But of course, that decision is legally enforceable, hence judicially reviewable. So it means that these companies going to fight hard not to be designated as gatekeeper. And it will take years of litigations before any kind of obligations of Article 5 and 6 would ever apply. So what does it mean? It means that we won't have clear ex ante rules of regulations where this is going to be applicable and enforceable like 2 months after the passing of the DMA. We'll have years of litigations, and that's not too bad, because competition rules and antitrust rules have been designed through an evolutionary process of judge-made law and rules discovered and applied by judges. So I think the DMA may be costly in terms of risk deterrence and innovation effect, but at the end of the day, it will virtually be almost inapplicable because it will take years of litigation before these companies may be designated as gatekeepers. But if it takes years of designation when you be designated as gatekeeper, the situation those companies are going to be in 10 years is going to be completely different than the situation they are now, right? And by the time you start applying those obligations and prohibitions, then the market reality will have completely changed. So I think it's very regrettable that we have a regulatory divergence on the transatlantic front, and it's also the DMA will overpromise and underdeliver in terms of cost, but also for those who want harsh rules of regulations, they may be very disappointed because those rules will not be enforceable very soon. So yeah, I close with that.
Very, very interesting perspective, Aurélien. Allow me a few follow-up questions, and let me address one question to you, Aurélien, and then also Megan. Aurélien, you said that the DMA will be costly, even though it will be inapplicable.
Yeah.
But it could be costly in terms of retaliatory measures imposed by the US government, similar to those that were taken into consideration when the US launched investigations into the digital services tax.
Yeah.
Taxes of individual EU member countries, including France, Italy, and Spain, I guess, threatening with basically retaliatory tariffs on French cheese and wine and other stuff. What are the prospects for a situation like this on the basis of opposition in the US against the imposition of the DMA in Europe?
I think the risks are real and are very underestimated. I mean, just think about the war we kind of have between Airbus and Boeing for years. I mean, the relationship between the US and Europe when it comes to commercial war and trade war is not virtual, it's real, and it has impact, massive impact, and you refer to the digital tax. But I think the DMA, there will be a pushback because of what I explained. There won't be antitrust bills that mimic the DMA. Therefore, this huge regulatory divergence will lead to this true impression by Americans that this is just a very protectionist measure. And we already saw that with Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo, who raised a number of concerns. So the question is, will that survive, perpetuate over different administrations? So just by the change of administration? I think that will be the case. I just remind you of the Obama years when the first Google shopping decisions, or at least investigations, started. President Obama was very, very critical about the actions of the European Commission and said that they have that the European Commission shouldn't be doing that, and this was designed by protectionist intent. Same comment took place during the Trump administration when Google Android was fined. Hey, with the Biden administration, you see a number of concerns, as I said, voiced by Gina Raimondo. And I think any administrations, Republican or Democrat administration in the US, will see that as a start of a trade war, alike Boeing and Airbus. And when it comes to that, I think there will be a bipartisan support in defending very strongly American interest and the interest of the Silicon Valley or any other place in the US against this kind of European wealth transfer. Because at the end of the day, you can see, I mean, what Megan described as a protectionist measure, but what is protectionism at the end of the day? It's a wealth transfer measure, right? You see that you degrade the competitive position of few companies, of few American companies, in the hope of increasing the competitive positions of some European companies. So it's a wealth transfer. You harm, I don't know, Google in order to help Quant, like the French search engine that no one knows. But so I think it is a wealth transfer, and I think that's going to generate bipartisan oppositions over administrations. And I think this is going to be resolved, unfortunately, at the WTO after years of litigation again.
Megan, do you want to add?
Yes, I'd love to. I'm so glad that you brought up Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, because her expression of serious concerns about the DMA, that was shocking for a lot of European commissioners, that she was defending big tech. And I think that's very telling that a Union Democrat is going to big tech's defense. Support for big tech has strong bipartisan support in Congress. Last month, the Senate Finance Committee Chairman Ron Wyden and Ranking Member Mike Crapo, they sent a joint letter to President Biden calling for a stronger response to the DMA. And they raised concerns also about the DSA, the Digital Services Act. I don't know, in the United States, an extreme move that the country could take, which it may not given the invasion of Ukraine, but it could invoke Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which, as you know, authorizes retaliatory restrictions on trading partners that impose unreasonable or discriminatory measures. And it's worth noting that the EU enjoyed a trade surplus of around $130 billion with the United States in 2019, much of that being high-tech products, while the US bilateral surplus in digital trade with the European Union was under $2 billion. So in total, yes, I think the US is going to have a very strong response. And I do believe that it may be taken to the WTO. In decided cases, the WTO dispute settlement body has strictly interpreted the national treatment commitment. So de jure discrimination is just as great an offense as de facto discrimination. I would not be surprised if it was taken to the WTO.
Yeah, thanks. I tend to share these views, de facto discrimination or discrimination simply by design. And this has been triggered decisions on similar issues in the past, obviously. Robertas, if you think it from a bird's eye perspective, what's actually in for smaller EU member states that do not have, these larger technology companies that we find, at least some of them in countries like France, in Germany. Do Lithuanians now basically have to revert to, say, German companies to receive better services because they are small and can offer, or smaller, or not in an entrenched position yet, and can offer better services in terms of overall user experience?
I think you're exactly right in the sense that I think the benefits from participating in the interconnected in the international market through a big platform, international platform, US platform, is disproportionately larger and more important for businesses in the small member states. And the platforms allow those businesses to generate economies of scale. It allows them to go in scope, to increase their client and supplier base, market reach. And a lot of businesses in the small countries, I think in the last 10, 20 years, they were created already with an idea of using and going through those platforms into international waters. I truly know, and I think a lot of startups are now being created without even thinking about the Lithuanian market, but thinking about the global market, how to reach the global market through those tools they have. And now, if the cost of using those tools goes up, or if they lose the ability to use the tools which they now can through those platforms, we in the small country, we don't have substitutes. I don't know if even the large countries like Germany or France and the search engines which they have could be treated as substitutes who could step in immediately. I don't know, for smaller countries that will be difficult, because then you'll have to go through many different platforms to reach the same, to go through the one maybe in one big country, France, to one for a different one to reach other countries. And that means huge costs, huge technology differences in business, and then to reach the same client base, or at least sustain the activity you are planning to get, it will be much harder for businesses in smaller countries than the larger. But I think everyone will suffer, and it might be only the difference of degree, maybe not of kind.
I think I can react to that if you want, Matthias. I think that's a very important point that Robert is making, because we have to come back to the rationale of the DMA. Why do we have the DMA? And I think the DMA is not even fulfilling its stated objectives. The very first purpose of the DMA was to avoid the fragmentation of the digital single market. Basically saying that we have too many national markets, too many members, and we need to have one European market, right? We know that Europe doesn't work in terms of digital innovation, digital disruptions, because we have 27 market, and that doesn't make sense in the global competition. We need to have one European market, and therefore we need to remove those national regulatory barriers. That was the purpose of the DMA. If you look at the working documents, the preparatory, and the rationale, because it takes as a legal basis the internal market, the completion of the internal market. So the point of the DMA is to end the fragmentation of digital single market. Well, does the DMA does that? Not at all. It doesn't even try to do that. And that in that respect, it could be legal, it could be illegal, according to a European Court of Justice, who decided that, who already judged that when a piece of legislation proposed by the European Commission doesn't fulfill the legal basis it claims to have, then the regulation may be illegal. So the issue we have is that we have many small markets in Europe. And what a startup does when you're, I don't know, in a very small market like, I don't know, Slovenia, Luxembourg, or Lithuania, or whatever, well, the first thing it does is not to expand in Europe. It's just to go to Silicon Valley to try to have some capital. And so we have all this brain drain from Europe going to the US because there's one big market, and that's the American market, and where the capital is, the venture capital at least is. And so the DMA doesn't solve any of that, doesn't address any of, I mean, it's not even interested in addressing those issues of venture capital, of size of the market. And I think it will worsen the trend that Roberta has described. Those startups in small markets in Europe will be even more keen to go to Silicon Valley and to grow there because they know that the DMA won't apply. They will be even more keen to be acquired by perhaps some large digital platforms because they will grow there, whereas acquisitions by large digital platforms will be virtually de facto prohibited in Europe after the DMA. So I think the unfortunate trend that we're already seeing, that digital disruption is taking place in the US and it's not taking place in Europe, I think it's going to increase, widen, worsen because of the DMA, because of the fragmentation of the digital single market that will persist forever, because that was one opportunity to complete the digital single market, and the European Commission hasn't addressed the problem at all. And I think that all will be at the expense of small startups in Europe, but also at the expense of consumers, because Europe will be even less the place where you can make digital innovation. And that will even reinforce the place such as Silicon Valley or other tech hub in the US. So it's strategically, it's very unfortunate, but even legally speaking, the DMA doesn't even address what it intended to address.
That's a good concluding statement, actually. But I want to pick this up again. If you think of it strategically, let's say, also take into account what is currently happening geopolitically, to put it mildly, and also take into account Europe's problem with innovation, Europe's democracy problem, Europe's problem with skilled labor, a regulatory fragmented digital single market, let alone the digital single market, different languages in the EU, companies going to the US, not necessarily the Silicon Valley, but basically going to the US because they are confronted with a nice, welcoming regulatory environment with a huge single market, where you can basically set up your business model on the basis of one language. And then you perhaps come back to Europe to roll out your business further. So what happened in the past was that Europeans, irrespective of the member state they live in or come from, usually benefited from imported innovation, from imported business activity. Now, also considering geopolitical developments, wouldn't it be strategically smart to basically put this entire initiative in the freezer and launch a discussion fora like in the Transatlantic Tech and Trade Council to discuss how you could best approach alleged harm, I would say, or antitrust problems in digital industries with network industries and large online platforms at the center, and then find a common ground, common standards, regulations that you can also take to go to our countries, convince them to join, let's say, a larger domain or a larger area where you apply more or less the same standards and regulation to these problems that you find. So would this be a kind of a better way to go ahead? Put this thing in the freezer and sit together with the US counterparts to discuss better rules?
If I may comment that, I was thinking about it, and there is another reason why there is a strong reason to put it in a freeze and a hold and ask a lot of questions about it. And in Europe and in the Parliament, I'm hearing those questions about security and data privacy and data security, especially in the geopolitical context and cyber attacks and everything. Those questions are being raised. But the DMA, one of the largest purposes of the DMA is to make data more available for many parties, either competitors or maybe even academia, or so many new gates to enter the data and to look at it and to acquire it. And I'm not trying to speculate what that could mean in a geopolitical context, but at least it seems that it's a very important question to be asked and to stop the train of going through with the DMA. As Aurélien said in the beginning, it's going with 99% certainty very fast. So I think there is at least one more reason to put it on hold and think again.
Yeah, any further views on this question?
Okay, I can jump in, and I think it's essential, the transatlantic debate. But I mean, we know what we can do to improve competition. So first of all, in terms of investment in innovation, well, investment in avoiding regulatory barriers, investment in universities, in venture capital, these are way companies innovate. And I think our regulators need to understand that innovation is a way to compete. It's not like competition leads to innovation. That's right. That's one aspect. Like the more you compete, the more you innovate. But the fundamental aspect is that innovation is competition. It's not like innovation is something different from competition. The more we will enable European companies and American companies to innovate, the more they will be competitive. And I think there's a complete misunderstanding of the causal relationship between innovation and competition. We always see competition leading to innovation and not innovation leading to competition, unfortunately. Why is the transatlantic partnership so important? Well, we have to design these fair, reasonable rules, but also we have to be, and precisely in light of the current events, we have to be very to see the reality of the world as it is, and precisely those two big powers, Russia and China, that they don't share the democratic value that both in Europe and the US we have. And what does it mean for digital innovation? It means that particularly China has engaged into some types of innovation mercantilism, which is basically stealing a lot of intellectual property right from Europe, from the US, and it's using that in a very aggressive manner. And there's a lot of rooms for arguments of unfair competition from China. And these cases of unfair competition needs to be addressed, because we cannot improve the competition level playing field in Europe or in the US if you have the biggest country in the world in terms of population and perhaps soon in terms of economic power that is fully, aggressively and openly engaged in unfair methods of competition internationally. I mean, we talk about these markets in Europe, but in Europe or even the US, it's very small, right? For example, the German market was like 80 million inhabitants. What is it? It's like one city in China. The French market is like another city in China. So we have to put things into perspective. Europe and US together is still smaller than China alone. And we have to have a stronger competitive landscape at the transatlantic level with stronger retaliation measures and stronger defensive measure when it comes to unfair method of competitions, excessive subsidies, and intellectual property right theft from China. But rather than that, unfortunately, we waging a war within the transatlantic bloc, and it doesn't make sense. And especially in light of the current events, it doesn't make sense. I think we should really see that helping American companies is a way for European businesses to scale up. And reverse-wise, American companies have a strong interest in having a thriving, innovative European economy, because that's an economy that shares democratic values and strong Republican principles. So I think definitely there is a win-win situation when one market can leverage its power thanks to a better integration with the other market. But rather than that, I think the DMA will take these two markets apart without reasonable and sincere discussions.
Speaking of win-win situations, if we leave this, let's say, geopolitical level and zoom a little bit into the technical details of the current proposal, we find that the DMA is actually a hybrid proposal. Parts of its obligations are self-enforcing, while others are what is called susceptible of being further specified before they are enforced. So at the same time, the proposal does not provide much clarity on how and when these obligations will be specified. Now, what's in for member states? What's the win situation for individual member states? Should member state governments actually agree to a new law of which they, including us, do not know how it will actually impact on what companies can continue to sell and what users can continue to purchase in their local market? Because companies may err on the side of caution and take down certain offers because they want to escape the risk of being exposed to very, very high fines. Also take into consideration the issues that we have with gatekeeper designation, as was outlined by Megan, the geopolitical consequences, or at least the geopolitical environment. What is actually in for EU member states to agree to this regulation? And maybe I should also put it into perspective. When we look at the debate in the Parliament about the Digital Services Act, it is being debated much more controversially because I feel that values play a much more important role in this particular debate, particularly the freedom of speech, individual right for data protection, and so on and so forth. It seems that these aspects did not play much of a role when the DMA was debated and negotiated.
Well, a quick answer for the DSA. I think the DSA is very controversial in Europe, also because it will impact European companies. And the idea is, as Megan said, the DMA is not controversial because it will impact almost virtually only American companies. So you have a broad consensus in Europe to harm American companies, and European lawmakers are very concerned when it comes to harming European companies. So, I mean, in a very cynical, self-interested manner, you can explain that in that kind of power relationship. When it comes to the national competition authorities, it reverts back to what I said about the completion of the digital single market. We were supposed to have one regulation, right, the DMA or whatever, and to get rid of national regulatory barriers. Well, I think we'll be in the worst of both worlds. Not only we'll have an extra regulation at the EU level that we didn't have before, but rather than preventing national regulations as we understood was the purpose of the DMA, now the European Commission will leave member states to go even further the DMA and to have their own national regulations. And we already saw that with Germany, and France announced to have new rules very soon. And every member state will further and will go even further to DMA with their own national rules. What does it mean? It means regulatory divergences within the EU, and will mean new regulatory barriers that we didn't have. So rather than getting rid of the regulatory barriers as the DMA claimed to have, it will not only increase, it will create regulatory barriers, but it will increase the amount of regulatory barriers that we had in the past. And that, of course, is very detrimental, because then you have a forum shopping effect. Companies will go to the jurisdictions that they have most like the greatest chance of winning, right? Let's assume, I don't know, the Italian competition authority is too lenient, then they'll go to the German competition authority. And that, if that's the case, they go to the Swedish. They have 27 venues. So you can think of how big and powerful rivals will effectively be able to harm and compel the big digital platforms to just do what they want them to do, right? So I think it will lead to a regulatory bottleneck here in Europe, and that huge legal uncertainty again will have a chilling effect, so that European entrepreneurs will go to Europe, or at least every entrepreneurs will try to stay away from Europe as much as they can because of these huge regulatory costs. So I think we have to take that in consideration, that all this discussion of empowering national competition authorities will have a tremendous impact in terms of legal uncertainty, and therefore in terms of innovation cost.
Yeah, Robertas, are you familiar with the current position of, let's say, governments in the Baltics region, like the government of Lithuania, the government of Estonia, Latvia? How do they feel about the DMA?
Right, so I've read the position which our government has presented. So the sad thing that there is a general agreement, I think, and the general agreement on a very abstract level with the proposed codes. You can find the agreement that since the proposal says that they're trying to harmonize the regulatory environment in Europe, well, our government's positions that's a good goal to follow, and we agree with that. And there are slight disagreements or even notes about some technical issues, about some responsibilities that could fall on national governments to implement DMA and to look after it. So there are some disagreements about the size of the fines or even the definition of a gatekeeper. So there are technical disagreements, but unfortunately I see we see general agreement in the European institutions. In our governments, we don't really find any opposition, I would say.
When I hear all this, I mean, you talked a lot about the objective to harmonize, in a way, EU competition law, or at least regulatory approaches to antitrust problems with large online platforms. But then you realize, when you look into the proposal, that there are so many provisions that, what I would say, increase legal certainty rather than decrease it and contribute to a solid business conducive regulatory playing field in the EU's. And I wonder if we should also talk about misinformation on the side of those who invented the law in the first place, also taking into account the pretty clear assessment of the EU's own regulatory scrutiny board, which was very critical and criticized many aspects of the European Commission's own impact assessment. And I think about all of this, this reminds me about the EU's, in a way, desperate attempt to push through the digital services tax proposal. Now it is officially in the freezer, it's off the table, at least at the EU level. many countries have adopted digital services taxes, which are now passed on to those who use digital services by those who have to pay the digital services tax in the first place. So, I mean, what is your take here? Do we also have to talk about how EU policymaking works in practice in terms of proper information about the impacts of certain provisions in a certain law? And also when we talk about what this means for smaller countries in comparison to larger countries. And we know that often controversial policies are pushed by larger countries. And at the end of the day, the smaller ones have to sign in as well. What are your thoughts? And I would also like to ask the audience to raise at least 1 or 2 questions, if there are some, because we are a bit running out of time. So you can use my, let's say, final question as a final concluding comment, if you'd like.
If there's no one, I can jump. Sorry. I think it's a very interesting question of how laws and directives and regulations are made in Europe. What we see is precisely that when European Commission proposes something, the likelihood of that proposal to become legislation is extremely high. All the time, whatever European Commission proposes, it will become law, because there's these 2 bipartisan, the 2 biggest parties in the European Parliament just agree on everything, and they agree on most issues. And when it comes to having a critical cost-benefit analysis or impact assessment, as they call it, of the European Commission proposal, I think it's not done in a I mean, just to be blunt, in a honest way. I think it's always, and we know it, just to take the example of GDPR, we know it's always underestimating the cost and overestimating the benefits. And even in the DMA, they said that they will make this kind of reports in terms of the cost of the DMA for the SMEs, right? Small and medium-sized, because they have this perception that European SMEs will be badly hurt. They have this perception even if they don't want to recognize it. What I'm saying is that, I mean, as opposed to the Washington legislative process, which may be overly blocked and overly gridlocked, I think the Brussels legislative process is overly easy and lenient, in a sense that any kind of legislation will pass. And therefore, to raise concerns about the DMA, whatever, you see that you're running against the waves or against the tides. Like, no political party is keen to have a critical view of the DMA. There's no country differences. You just ask the Eastern European countries. Well, they have exactly the same position as the Western European countries. So there's no differences in terms of location, in terms of parties. There's this broad consensus, and even more when it comes to the standing of Europe globally. You know, this so-called Brussels effect. Whenever it comes to Europe regulating with extraterritorial effect, like showing the world its values and standards so that they can regulate with effect in US or in China, then I think that plays a very important role in helping those legislation to pass, because European lawmakers may have a great pride in ensuring that those legislation will become global standards, if you want. Mm-hmm. And I think the GDPR was the case, and the DMA will be the case. Like, irrespective of the cost and benefits, what I'm saying is that the value, the standing, the prestige of these regulations becoming global standard push European lawmakers to just let them pass without a sincere, honest economic analysis. It's more in terms of values of prestige rather than true economic analysis.
Mm-hmm. Megan?
So obviously I am not a European Commission expert on how these things go, but something that's come to mind when Gary and I were analyzing the DMA, all this major enthusiasm for the DMA and similar legislation, right? I'm viewing this as kind of part of a broader trend of digital protectionism that is growing within Europe, but also within other countries, notably China and India. Something that we analyzed in our paper is that the French National Cybersecurity Agency, they're in the midst of revising its cybersecurity certification program known as SecNumCloud to exclude foreign cloud firms from serving government agencies and some 600 French firms that provide like vital government services. And the rationale is that foreign firms cannot be trusted to handle or store data. And that's a view, as I said before, very similar to that of the Chinese and that of India. And the proposed regulations would also require cloud firms to store and process all customer and technical data in the EU and carry out supervision and administration within the EU, essentially undercutting the advantages inherent in the distributed nature of cloud services. And French protectionism, beyond it violating EU national treatment obligations in the GATS and the WTO government procurement agreement, there's this broader ongoing trend of distrust in the digital sphere for other countries. And I think that is going to have serious negative impacts on economies, including the EU and China and India. Combating data localization measures abroad is going to be particularly difficult for the US, as President Biden has proclaimed Buy America as like the touchstone of all federal expenditure, and has largely not reversed Donald Trump's abuse of the national security exemption to trade obligations. So if President Biden decides to mount a serious campaign on behalf of open markets and US commercial rights abroad, he has to be prepared to simultaneously reform practices at home. So bringing it back to the DMA, all this enthusiasm for attacking American and other foreign firms, I think that's very dangerous. That's obviously the antithesis of free and open trade. And we know that free trade is efficient and it's good for economies, and the digital economy has done wonders for the EU as well as the United States. So getting everyone on the same page going forward, I think, is going to be extremely important, or there will be negative ramifications in the future. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, Bertas, final concluding remark from your side as well.
Right. So I think the final point I was, when you were talking about how the laws in Europe are passed and how to think about it. So yeah, I think there is that concept of democratic deficit. And I've noticed that when thinking about DMA and talking about who knows about the DMA in Europe. So that's a very good question. So there is a huge, of course, big companies, big platforms are very interested in following that. But as Megan said in the beginning, it's only mostly US companies who follow that regulation. Now, we might see that small and medium-sized businesses who depend on the platforms for their work, and startups who depend on platforms for their continuing their business growth, they're interested in following, but they cannot follow every big chunk of regulation, both European and national, since, as we know, small enterprises usually operate on the margin and they have their hands full every day and they're trying to build a business and then to follow pages of regulation and think. And we discussed that it's not really clear how the regulation will affect them and their activity, and it's not clear how the platforms will react to those changes, and they don't really know what to expect. And so you're just sitting, and you can just sit and wait until see what happens if since you don't really have a strong connection with Brussels to talk about those issues or raise concerns. So I think, yeah, there is that deficit, and it's hard to see who could raise the voice that the Commission or Parliament would hear, if not for the big platforms themselves. So that's unfortunate, but I'm not sure where to follow from that.
No, I share this view absolutely. So thank you very much for engaging with us today in this discussion, for, in a way, enlightening more people about what I would call the more adverse or also unintended consequences of one particular regulation in the EU's package of digital single market policies. I think we could talk longer. There's much to debate also when it comes to other proposals, but this is for future. events. I would like to thank you again, thank our audience. I wish you all, depending on where you are, a nice evening and pleasant day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.